Greetings, this is Charles Darwin, and you probably have the idea that evolution is a relentless march forward. However, sometimes evolution can go backwards. And that's what we're going to see right now. Here's an example. Actually, evolution does not have a direction that it always follows. Evolutionary adaptation goes in whatever direction might be locally and immediately advantageous for a population of organisms, for the individuals in that population. Sometimes that means that organisms evolve to become more complex, but it could just as easily mean that organisms can evolve into a simpler form. And when we see these organisms, we sometimes think that they're missing links between simple ancestors and more complex forms. When in what reality we're seeing is more complex forms that have evolved into a simpler structure. This is one example. This is Spanish moss. And you look at this and you might say, well, all I see is little green strands. Maybe it is sort of like a moss or some very simple plant. You find this growing a lot on the trees in the American Southeast. However, this is a relative of pineapple. There are many other plants in the family Bromeliaceae, such as this one, that are more complicated, have more complex flowers or bigger plants, such as pineapples. And what has happened is that many of the bromeliads grow as epiphytes up the branches of trees, and in order to do that, many of them have simplified their structure. And this, perhaps, is the one that has simplified the most. There are other examples that we see of plants that have simplified during their evolution. For instance, the whisk fern, Psilotum nudum, is a plant that when you look at it, it looks like a living fossil. It looks like it came right out of the Silurian period, like it was one of those early land plants, the first ones to live on land. But actually, it turns out, when the DNA is studied, that the whisk fern is just a degenerate fern. Its ancestors were presumably more complex than the whisk fern is today. Perhaps the ultimate example is duckweed. And when you see duckweed, some people just glance at it and they think it's pond scum. And you look more closely, you see lots of little tiny floating surfaces. And it looks so simple, it must be one of the earliest plants, right? But it turns out it is a degenerate monocot plant. And it just looks simple to us, not because it's always been simple, but because it's simplified from more complex ancestors. You see, in evolution, it doesn't really matter which direction you go, towards more complicated or towards simpler. Usually evolution produces more complex forms because there are more ways to become more complex than to become simpler. However, evolution can go either direction, and perhaps you can't say that evolution has any preordained direction at all. This is Charles Darwin, and tally ho, and I'm in.